Hello. In our last task, we just completed creating your classroom and group mindsets and behaviors action plan, which organizes the lessons, large group presentations, and small groups your counseling program will deliver next year to teach students the mindsets and behavior standards. Another type of action plan that helps you organize your program is the Closing the Gap action plan, which is our next task. If you are a Gold Star level school, when you identified your annual student outcome goals for your counseling program, you identified one of those goals to help close a gap among specific targeted group of students. We will now create an action plan outlining the strategies, activities, and interventions you'll conduct to address this goal for closing the identified gap. The action plan will also outline the data you'll collect to assess whether or not you've made an impact on closing that gap. In the online platform, you will see the student outcome goal that you specified that would be your closing the gap goal. You will also see the possible activities, strategies, and interventions you listed in your student outcome goal plan. This will be a good starting point for you to more specifically plan what strategies, activities, and interventions you'll use to help address the gap and work towards meeting your goal. One of the main strategies for counselors to use in closing a gap for a targeted group of students is small group counseling. This is why, when you created your student outcome goal in Module 2 that addressed closing a gap, we recommended you include a small group as one of your possible interventions. In addition to that, you will start identifying other strategies and activities for closing your gap. It's important to think beyond what you typically deliver for interventions. Remember, closing a gap among student groups often requires more targeted approaches and some thinking outside of the box ideas. It's also a good idea to look at best practices and evidence-based approaches in order to have a measurable impact. You can look at resources that identify such evidence-based practices such as What Works Clearinghouse, CASEL, SAMHSA, CDC, Ask a Scale, or other journals, magazines, online forums, or conferences. Don't forget the bigger strategies and activities you do that may be related to your Closing the Gap goal. For example, if your Closing the Gap goal focuses on discipline and reducing the number of office behavior referrals for targeted students, one of your strategies you list in your Closing the Gap action plan might include the conflict resolution classroom lessons that all students receive, including your targeted Closing the Gap students. And be sure to include indirect services as part of your strategies and interventions as well. These would be the activities you do on behalf of the students you're targeting, in addition to the direct services you'll provide to students. An example of indirect strategies might be the consulting work you do with parents and the collaboration you do with teachers. Perhaps you conduct parent workshops or meetings, or even consult individually with the parents of your Closing the Gap students. You might collaborate with teachers on suggestions for potential classroom strategies. In your Closing the Gap action plan, you'll also identify the skills and knowledge you want your targeted Closing the Gap students to learn, described by the mindset and behavior standards, and you'll identify how you will assess whether or not they've learned these skills and knowledge. If you recall, you identified certain mindset and behavior standards and assessment items when you originally created your student outcome goal that serves as your Closing the Gap goal. In our system, you'll see this information added automatically to your Closing the Gap action plan. You'll also see the classroom lessons, large group presentations, and/or small groups you entered on your classroom and group mindsets and behaviors action plan, including those activities you listed to address the mindsets and behaviors associated with your Closing the Gap student outcome goal. You'll select those classroom and group activities that specifically support your Closing the Gap goal. These activities will be added to your Closing the Gap action plan. You can always make additions to your activities as you think more about how you want to address this goal for closing the gap. You may have thought of more or different strategies. Here's where you can save these and generate a working plan to use for when you get ready to plan your small group, lesson, or other activities. If you happen to add additional classroom lessons or small groups, these will automatically be added to your classroom and group mindsets and behavior action plan. Remember that closing the gap work also needs to include indirect student services as part of your strategies and interventions. Indirect student services are those services provided on behalf of students as a result of the school counselor's interactions with others. Here's where you'll also describe the indirect student service activities you plan to conduct as part of your Closing the Gap work. For now, your tasks to complete are: 1. Identify the activities from your classroom and group mindsets and behaviors action plan for Closing the Gap. 2. Enter any additional direct student services activities if needed. 3. Enter indirect student services. One step forward, please remember to reach out with any questions or concerns. You can contact me at rfraser@doe.in.gov. If your question pertains to the online platform, you can also contact Amy Portis of Inspire Success, our technical partner, at amy@inspiresuccess.org.